Hey guys, I have another interesting game for you today against a strong FIDE Master, Paradox XXX1, whose real name is Arkady Gittleson, and he was playing white in this game. So let's see how this game went. E4. I'm going to turn on the analysis engine here. C6, so it looks like I'm going for a Caro-Kann, but it's the Drunken Master. So he goes for this rather interesting setup with Bishop G2, but with the Drunken Master, you can pretty much ignore anything that white does or black does and pretty much plays the same moves. So E6. So let's go through these opening moves real quick. As soon as he castles, I'm like, thanks, bro, because now I've got H5 and I'm coming for your king. And he ignored that. Now, I've seen some players play H4 in such positions. Some players even could play H3 so that you meet H4 with G4. But he ignored that and he played D5, which I'm honestly not convinced is the correct response to this advance of the H pawn. So anyway, I took and he takes and I played E5 because obviously he's threatening to take on E6 and expose this rook, so E5. And then he plays F4, which is quite an interesting response because he wants to open up his rook on my F7 pawn. And he's pretty much saying that your H pawn is not really doing much. So I'm like, all right, let's see, H4. And now he takes. And I took here first, which was actually a huge strategic mistake because white here had a crushing move E6. And this pawn can be safely ignored because if it takes, then just king h1, and white's king is completely safe. And now this king is in big trouble after a move like, let's say, takes. And what is this? And this guy is attacked as well. So that would be strategically a lost position for black already. So I should have, instead of hg, I should have just taken on e5. Instead, I played hg, and then he took on g3, and then I quickly took on e5. And then I wondered, why didn't I go queen h4? Because I saw queen h4 after I took on e5. So let's see my reaction at around this point. So I'm going to show you part of my stream here. So I took really fast. Why didn't I play queen h4? Come on, man. Why didn't I play queen h4? So I was puzzled that I didn't play queen h4. But in hindsight, my intuition with taking the pawn was absolutely correct, because let's say if queen h4, then first of all he can just ignore this by playing queen f3, but he could also still play e6, and he's got those same things going for him as we discussed before, and this pawn is not relevant because if takes, then king f2, and now he's threatening rook h1 and trapping my queen. So in hindsight, queen h4 was not the right move, and my intuition with just taking the pawn on e5 was correct. So anyway, the game goes on. d6, so he's attacking this rook, but this is a positional mistake because this rook really wants to be on a7 to defend this pawn. Whereas this pawn is doing really well on d5 right now, and on d6 it becomes weak. So d6 is a positional mistake, because then I can just play rook a7, defend this guy, and now this guy is threatened. So now he has to hold that. So he plays knight e4, and then I get queen h4, threatening the h pawn. So he can't really defend this guy. If he plays h3, then I just take on h3. And in the game, I saw that if bishop g5 hitting my queen, then I just drop the queen back safely, and I'm completely fine in this position. So he probably saw that, and he decided to ignore the h pawn and just go on with his developments like queen d3. Then I took it. I took the pawn. The scrolling is giving me some trouble here. Okay, and king f2. And now I see that his threat here is rook h1, hitting my queen and then hitting this guy. So I simply played queen h4, so that, if he goes back, then I've solved the problem of rook h1. And if he does something else, well, I can react accordingly. Maybe I can even play queen f6, worst case scenario. But instead, he decided to play king e2, go in the center with his king. So his king is sort of on the run right now because his whole castling structure has been broken. All three of these pawns have vanished. So he's running toward the center, but that just allows bishop g4 check, king d2, and now here the move queen h2 was really strong because it pins this guy, prevents rook h1. But psychologically speaking, a move like queen h2 is really hard to make because he just came back from that square, so why would he go there again? But in this position, that move was the strongest move. Instead, I played f5, thinking that he doesn't really have rook h1. But I was actually wrong, because if rook h1, then I would have taken takes and rook takes. But then he can play a move like knight f2, and it's far from over for white. Black definitely is still better in this position, but white can put up a fight here. So it was a little bit unnecessary for me to play f5. But anyway, I played f5, and he also thought that rook h1 was not anything special. So king c3 instead. So he's now trying to perhaps play a move like b3, king b2, and get castle queenside if he can. So his king is like really on the run. But he gives up the piece. Because if he tried to save the piece, well, this pawn would eventually drop. And once this pawn drops, well, then my rook comes in the middle. And then his king is under fire anyway. So he figured he could sacrifice this piece, but get his king out to safety, and then target my king in the center. So let's see how this game went. So king c3 takes, and bishop takes. And now he's threatening bishop g6, and my bishop's in trouble. So I played knight f6. I think no problem. You can give me a check, and I could just move to safety. Note that now rook h1 is not even possible because I can just take on e4 with check. And if takes, then I take an h1, and my queen is defended. So instead he played here bishop g6, and I just moved the king away to d8. Now in hindsight, the computer is suggesting king d7, I guess because it wants to take this pawn out immediately. And that looks like a really good strategic plan for black. But I don't know. I just didn't see this idea. But I played king d8, thinking my king's safe. My knight could come to d7 later. But this pawn is a huge thorn in black's position. So eliminating this guy would have been the right strategic decision. Anyway, bishop e3, and now I began to sense that I began to sense the strength of this pawn on d6. So let's see my reaction at around this point. So it's around this mark here where he's just played, and I'm thinking of knight d7. I don't like knight d7, but what do? I have to do that. I really don't like it. Yeah, so I didn't quite like that move, but as it turned out, it was in fact the best move in the position because he's threatening to take on b6. The problem with knight bd7 is pretty much I'm saying that I can't do anything about this strong pawn on d6, and I have to play around it, which is psychologically it's really difficult. But objectively speaking, you will see that the computer even agrees with knight bd7 being the only move or the best move for black in this position, because the way to approach this position is that you have won a piece, and now it's just a matter of consolidating your position, whereas it is white who has to prove the advantage or his initiative for the sacrifice piece, and he's not able to do that. So knight bd7 playing passively is still the best way for black in this position. So now he should have played b3 to get his king back to safety, as the computer suggests, but he played knight to a3. I guess his plan is to play knight c4, and I decided to bring this rook into the game with rook a8 because I want to really get him into the action. And I saw rook h1 as a possibility, but I thought that queen for two rooks is a bargain in this position. So rook h1, but I get rook c8 check first. King b3, I get bishop e6 check as well, and then c4, and then I can take, and rook takes h1. And as you can see, my assessment of the sacrifice or the exchange of the queen for two rooks was spot on, because white has lost a lot of force with those two rooks, and my rooks are really active. This rook is super active, that rook is super active, this pawn is weak, this bishop is strong, that pawn is weak. So white's really struggling to hold this position. So he tried, as a last resort, some activity with bishop g5, and then I already missed knight c5 check, but I saw the other check, which is, or fork, or pin in this case, which is rook h3. And unfortunately for him, that means his queen is pinned to the king, and it's GG, because he goes back bishop e3, but now I see knight c5 check, because now if he takes, then I take the queen, and that's game. So he resigned in this position, and let's look at my reaction around this point. I'm low on time. It's because I'm doing commentary, so I better shut up. Yes. Gotcha. Yeah! That's a strong FIDE Master to beat, bro. 2649 is not easy. But the feeling, I felt like I've lost the loving feeling, but it's back now. I'm gonna watch Top Gun, by the way. That was a reference to Top Gun. I'm watching it tomorrow. So let's see this game. So yeah, that was the game, and I hope you enjoyed that game as much as I did, and I look forward to entertaining you with more such beautiful games in the Drunken Master.